The session is about the traditional academic publishing system and how it will change to accommodate and disseminate massive research output from the emerging world. So I welcome you all to the session. In order to answer that question, which is rather complex, I think we need to define what is the traditional academic publishing system. We also need to discuss what is the massive research output from the emerging world and how one must change to meet the other. Thank you very much. In order to do that, I have a panel assembled here. I'm very honored to be joined by Pippa Smart. Pippa is Editor-in-Chief for Learned Publishing. That is the official publication of the Association for Learned and Professional Society Publishers. She's also the Vice President and the President-elect of the European Association of Science Editors. Prior to that, she worked at Blackwell, Cabby, and Cambridge University Press. She's a member of INASP, which is a development organization that supports editors and publishers in the developing world. She's also set up the African Journals Online program and has been a consultant in the field for the last 10 years. On my right is Marianne Hollingsworth. I'm also pleased to be joined by you, Marianne. Marianne is Director of Publisher Relations at Clarivate Analytics, formerly Thomson Reuters, and prior to that, ISI. She's also the Associate Director, or was the Associate Director for the National Federation of Advanced Information Services. Prior to that, she was academic, corporate, and public librarian. She's an active SSP member and has served on the board of directors at SSP and has been co-chair of the Education Committee. And she's also on the board of the National Information for Standards Organization. To the far right is Duncan McRae. He's Director of Open Access and Editorial at Wolters Kluwer. In that role, he develops and implements the open access policy for both Wolters Kluwer and for Medno's open access journals. Prior to that, he was managing editor for Neurosurgery, which is the official publication of the Congress of Neurological Surgeons. He was senior manager of editorial and editorial operations at Pri-Med, which is a leading CME provider. And he was managing editor of Brain Pathology, which is the official publication of the International Society of Neuropathology. And last, my name is Philip Purnell, and I was priorly a researcher. I held a post at the Institute of Psychiatry in London, and following that at the Max Planck Institute of Psychiatry in Munich. I then went into the pharmaceutical industry, working for both AstraZeneca and UCB. So had I stayed there, I could have been in the competing conference in the other rooms on the other side of the hotel. But I didn't. I moved into the information world and spent 15 years at Thomson Reuters. And the last 5 years, I've been in Dubai in the Middle East. And I'm now heading up the professional services division of Knowledge E, a publisher, a niche publisher serving the emerging regions. So with no further ado, I would like to ask Pippa to take up to start off. Let me just put your presentation up.
Okay, so fantastic. Thank you very much, Phil, for inviting me to speak here and for all of you for turning up. So what I'd like to do is talk about the position of editors when we're looking at an increased number of articles coming from different regions of the world, particularly the emerging economies. And basically, I'd like to start by saying it's a big world out there. I mean, there's a lot of research being done, and there's some huge increases. Recent figures that have come out of the NSF have shown that although the global increase in articles is around about, they're tracking about 3-4%, the increases that are coming from places like India and China are up in the double figures. So annually we're getting a huge amount more research coming out. And the journal that I edit, Learned Publishing, we're seeing this as well. And there are a couple of what are they called? Wordle things? Anyway, something I found on the internet. I've taken out the UK and the USA, but the blue are our reviewers for the last 2 years, and the sort of red and brown on this side are our author groups. And the UK and USA accounts for, in each group, about 50-60%, but the rest of them are coming from these countries. We've got reviewers from over 50 countries, which was amazing when I did it, and I checked the figures twice. And we've got authors coming from over 30 countries. And as you see there, China is a big contender. We're getting a lot of articles from China, which is, I think, in common with a lot of journals. We're getting a lot of content. It's a very big country. There's a lot of research. So there's a big wide world. There's a lot more articles coming out. And if we've got this, fantastic smorgasbord of articles and research come from all around the world, why is this a problem? This should be brilliant. This should be fantastic. And why is it a problem? Well, we have to say, guys, do we have a bit of a trust issue? And, are we trusting this research that's coming from all these other countries? A bit tricky here. And I'd like to sort of, expand some of this and say, actually, why do we think there are issues? Why are there problems with this research coming out? Because we're working in an environment where we should all be working on the same, on the same level playing field. We are all about getting the research more public so it can be used, so it can affect policies, so it can improve the welfare of everybody in the world. So you've got authors and you've got readers. And, the authors want to get their research out. The readers want to discover the best research. So that's great. But in between the authors and the readers, you've got a whole passel of people. You've got institutions. You've got publishers, either commercial, not-profit, organizational, institutional. And they have slightly different missions. They have slightly different mandates on actually what research they want to publish and what they want to make public. And then you've got the editors. You've got the reviewers. And I'd like you to take your pick, which one is the happy guy up there and which one is the one banging their head on the desk. And all of these people are putting barriers between getting research out and getting research understood. And so when we've got this enormous increase in research, actually, what are the problems and what are the editorial challenges that are being faced by editors from all around the world trying to deal with this tsunami, and in some cases it is a bit of a tsunami of content. So the first problem, language. Language, big problem, because I'm a native English speaker, and a lot of the international journals, probably the majority of them, are publishing in English. And yet, not all the world speaks English. A bit of a shock, I know. But, there are a lot of other languages out there. And we're forcing authors to translate their research into English. And that's a hard call for a lot of people. I speak what I call holiday French. If you ask me to publish in a French journal, I can tell you now I would never get published. Language is a really big issue. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, bias. People are biased. I wish we weren't, and hopefully we can rise above it. And I think the talk yesterday afternoon was really quite inspirational about diversity. I'll say that word quite quietly because it's not diversity, it's about inclusion, and it's inclusion of all peoples. But people are biased, and we find that in peer review. People show bias against an article that comes from an institution they don't know versus an institution that they do know and they respect. And they come at it with different opinions. And so we have issues of bias that we need to overcome. We also have problems with ethics. And, ethics is such a big issue within the editorial world. And just to say, for those of you I promised cat pictures, this is the cat picture. And, ethics are a problem. And whilst there is a common understanding in many places about what is ethically correct and what is ethically incorrect, there are some subtle differences around the world. And I train editors and researchers in a lot of different countries, and there are some slightly different perspectives about what is considered ethical and unethical. And there are some real grey areas. So ethics, potentially a big issue. Another problem we have as well is inflation. Authors inflate their research, and of course they do. You know, they've done an itty-bitty research project, with a sort of over studying about 5 people, and they've drawn enormous global conclusions about this, and they're really proud of their research. So when they submit it to you, they tell you it's the best thing that's ever been published, because that's what authors do. I speak as an author here, not just as an editor. We think our stuff is the greatest, and that can be quite tricky to actually filter your way down as an editor, as a reviewer, and say, actually, guys, what is the real story underneath this article? And that's doubly difficult when somebody is desperate to be published, and they're going to big up their research findings. And the other problem, the flip side of inflation, is geographical inflation. If your journal has an impact factor, you will be more likely to receive submissions than if you don't have an impact factor. And you'll be more likely to receive submissions from authors that need to publish in impact factor journals than perhaps the researchers in areas which is not so important. So inflation of submissions is another problem. And authors around the world are under huge pressure to publish. And these are just a couple of examples. These are real-life examples, because authors are pressured not just to publish, but to publish in the quote-unquote right journals. India. The MCI and the DCI, so it's the Medical Council of India and the Dental Council of India, and the UCG, the University Council, have revised their list of accredited journals just recently. And if you don't publish your article in one of the accredited journals, you don't get accreditation. And several authors have got caught in this. And I know one editor that got an article submitted to him because the author said, I've already had this published. I'm being transparent. I'm not trying to hide this. This article has already been published. But it was published in a journal which, when I submitted it, was on the accredited list. But that's now no longer on the accredited list. So I've got to publish somewhere else. Because if I don't publish somewhere else, my job's on the line. And this is my research. So can you publish my article? So, this is an author who has been let down by their system because suddenly their work is not accredited in a way that it has to be for them to retain their job. I've had examples of an article I received, a really good article, I accepted it, and when I accepted it, I said, this is not original research, this is a case study. So therefore, it will be classified as a case study in the journal. And the author said, please don't do that, because if you do that, it doesn't count as an original article, and I won't get accreditation. So can you reclassify my article? Because if you don't do it, I don't get the accreditation. Malaysia and Nigeria, and I'm sure there's other countries. If you're within Nigeria, if you publish in a Nigerian journal, that article is not recognized within the accreditation system in Nigeria, and the same in Malaysia. Doesn't matter how good that Nigerian journal is, it's not recognized because it's not again, excuse the quotation marks again, but it's not an international journal, and there is concern over bias and conflict of interest. Now, of course, this is hugely problematic for the researchers, but it's also problematic for the journal editors because they lose all the good research within these areas. And there's naivety. I made a mistake, can I republish with you? And this came up just recently. I was asked by a researcher, her group had submitted to a journal and they were published, and it was great. They then realized it was a fraudulent journal. And the journal said it had an impact factor. It didn't have an impact factor. It said it was indexed in all these places. It wasn't indexed in all these places. Now, okay, maybe the authors were a bit dumb to have submitted to this journal, but they did, and they got published. But of course, no accreditation. So they said, oh, well, in which case we made a mistake, so can we withdraw from that journal and publish our article with you? Well, what do you do in something like that? Is it duplicate publication? So there are a lot of issues with that and a lot of naivety within authors about how to publish and the ethics of publishing, leading them into potential career problems. So how do editors respond? Do you open the window or do you shut the window firmly? Do you say, actually, no, I'm not going to accept articles from these other regions because they're too problematic and I don't trust them and I'm a bit suspicious? Hopefully, editors don't. Hopefully, editors are ethical enough, because we need to be ethical as well, to actually look dispassionately on all submissions and consider them. But what strategies do we need to engage when we're receiving articles from all around the world and we're receiving a higher volume of articles? So this is what I do. This is not necessarily right, but this is what I do. Don't worry about the language. Just look at the content. So when articles are sent to reviewers, and I know there are issues with the language, I say to the reviewers, look, I know this is really tricky, but can you just tell me whether you think there's something good in that article? And if there is, we can worry about the language later. We can deal with that later, but can you tell me if there's something good in that article? But that's not always easy for reviewers, because sometimes they can't even tell if there's something good in the article because it's written so badly. Extra TLC. As a journal, we do tender loving care to all our authors, but we give that extra bit to the non-native English speakers. And I'm far more tolerant of badly written or badly structured articles if they're coming from non-native English speakers than I am for English speakers. Potential authors, please take note of this. And extra feedback, extra work. If an author is coming from an area where obviously they're struggling with the language, but there seems to be good stuff in their article, we give them a lot more feedback. So instead of a reviewer report of 50 lines, they'll get a couple of pages. They'll get an annotated Word file coming back saying, this paragraph doesn't say this. Do you mean to say this? We try and clarify things with them. But of course, we don't do that for English speakers. Basically, you're on your own, guys. You've got to get it right. But it's also good for us because it means that we need to improve our focus. Actually, what is it we really want to publish? And this leads me on to the problems with this kind of approach. First one, time, biggest issue. It takes a lot more time to deal with an article that is badly written, badly structured, badly argued, but you want to publish it because it's got good stuff in. So time is a really big issue. I published an article a couple of years ago. I'd like some of your sympathy. It was 15,000 words when it was submitted. I mean, basically, it was a small book. But it had really good stuff in it. We managed to whittle it down to about 7,000 words. I reckon I must have spent a week working on this article. And frankly, between you and me, but don't tell anybody, I deserve to be a named author on this article. It took a lot of work. Anyway, we did publish it, and it's a really good article, and I'm not going to tell you which one it is. So really good. But that's a heck of a lot of time, and you don't always have that time. This is a little bit of a tricky one, lower quality articles, and particularly fewer citations. Now, fortunately, I'm in an area where impact factor is not important, except for last year when we went below 1, and I was gutted. But, impact factor, if you're an editor and you're trying to make an impact with your journal and getting a good impact, you don't get a high impact factor if you're publishing peripheral articles that are not going to get cited. And that will affect editorial judgments. It's not fair, it's not right, but it will affect editorial judgments because they don't get cited. And I know in our journal we've published some exceptionally good and important articles, and they get very little attention. But they're there. If you really want to know about Pakistan research, if you want to know about Chinese research, you may only want to know once in your life, but you'll find it in the journal because we've got those articles. We have published them, but they don't do a huge amount of good for our journal in terms of citations and social traction. So we need to bear that in mind. Focus. I said about the focus thing. It's really difficult. You get these bright, shiny articles, and it's new stuff. This is new information that you're not getting from anywhere because you haven't seen that article coming out of Malaysia, coming out of India, coming out of Sri Lanka, and you're getting new information, and it's really shiny. So you're very tempted to publish it, and that can lead you away from your core focus. And so that's the bright, shiny articles. And this is a tricky one, power. If an author is desperate to publish, and a lot of authors who are coming out from the emerging countries are desperate to publish in the emerging country, in the developed impact factor journals, they will do anything you ask them to do. So with an author from the USA, if it goes back to the review saying you need to clarify this, you need to do this, quite often they'll push back and they'll say, I don't think I do. I actually think this is clear enough, and they'll make an argument for it. But if you're getting an author from, Nigeria, and you rewrite their article for them, they just say yes, because you're the one with the power. And that, as an editor, you've got to be so careful about, because very easy to abuse your power. And the elephant in the room, and this really is the big elephant in the room, is it right for me to be publishing articles which are not going to reach those readers that actually need that information? I'm a subscription journal. If I'm publishing important information coming out of Kenya, coming out of Malawi, coming out of Sri Lanka, coming out of Russia, and actually that's research that needs to get to researchers in that country who don't get access to that journal because it's a subscription journal, actually, am I doing the right thing to publish that? Would it not be better for that journal to be published in a local national journal which will reach the right readers? And this is a real elephant in the room. We actually, and Phil knows I have quite strong feelings on this, we need to actually build a much better, stronger and sustainable national journal environment than we have at the moment. So that, I think, a bit of an elephant in the room. And my final answer to all this, and I have the answer to all of this, and this is the second Douglas Adams question here. I don't have the answer. This is the best answer I could come up with, 42. Make out of it what you will. It's a big challenge for us, and I don't think we've found the right answers yet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pippa. That was excellent. So I'll just show you some brief data. So we've talked about the issue, and what I wanted to talk about is the numbers a little bit. And we can see, just looking in the Web of Science, that around 30 years ago, in 1980, so more than 30 years ago, nearly 40 years ago, you could see that there was different proportions of research published by people based in different regions of the world. And over the last 4 decades, that has developed. You can see these lines at the bottom here that represent people in the regions of, that top one there is the ASEAN, sorry, it's not, it's the Middle East countries. The next one is the Latin America countries. And then there are the African totals. So if you look at those, you can see, in fact, that in the last 10 years, they have increased very steeply from their base. The quickest growing region of all is this light blue line, which is Asia Pacific. And that's had 2 inflections, one in the early 90s and one about 10 years later. And this has chiefly been driven, but not entirely, by China, which has now overtaken in output all of the other regions. Here you've got the European Union, 28 countries, and just underneath you've got the European 15 countries. You know that in Europe we have been growing the number of countries in the Union, but you can see that the original ones are what we would call Western Europe, and then the additional ones are more from Eastern Europe and Central Europe. And if you just look back 10 years, there was almost no difference between the output of the two, meaning that the increase, this difference is responsible for the increase in output from the Eastern and Central European countries. And the United States is here, also has increased, but not as quickly as some of the other regions. In fact, I can show you that if you look at the blue bar 1980, the United States was responsible for 36% of the authors in the Web of Science. That's now gone down to 25%. So it's actually not true when people say the Web of Science is an America-focused database. In fact, 3 in every 4 papers don't feature an American author at all. In India, the proportion of Indian authors has more than doubled, and in China, it was negligible 40 years ago, and it now counts for 15% of the articles published. And bear in mind that in the Web of Science, we are talking about journals that are considered international, high impact, and representative of a network of scholars in any given field. So these are what we would call the highest quality or the most elite journals. And this doesn't represent all of the other journals in the world where we can't see that the increase, which must be enormous. There are many more journals in the world that are not indexed anywhere. And this represents a lot of challenges and barriers to people who are trying to publish in what is termed an international journal. People are always told in countries around the world that they need to publish internationally, but there's very often no definition of what that means. An international journal is often considered to be a journal that is indexed in either the Web of Science or in Scopus. Sometimes it's for the reason of the university ranking systems. Some of those use Scopus and some use Web of Science. Others want to see that the journal has an impact factor, which means it must be in Web of Science. So there's a huge drive for people to publish in those journals, but there is a kind of limited number of journals that are indexed. So with the massive rise in output, they've now had to turn to local or regional journals. So there is an insufficient number of international journals, and therefore we have a rise in journals from universities around the world who naturally assume that if they do it right, their journal will then be added to the indexes, which presents a problem for people like Marianne, because they have to make decisions and choose and say, we have our criteria and we can't accept every single journal in the world. So I spend a lot of my time talking to editors and small publishers and researchers in emerging countries and try to give them advice on also try to manage their expectations. If it's a journal which is very institutional and nobody reads it outside that institution, I try to explain this is not going to make it into an international citation database, and therefore temper their expectations. Also, there's a tendency of people to name their journal, rename it the International Journal of, which of course is an exaggeration, and I've told them a million times not to exaggerate, because first of all, what the evaluators do is they look at the editorial board and they look at the author affiliations, and they will see whether it's really an international journal or regional or national or even an institutional journal. So these exaggerated claims are going to disqualify the application. And the other thing to look at is the claiming of being indexed in things which aren't actually indexes. That's something else that comes up a lot. So we do ask people to try to get that claim right. And there are many, many other mistakes people make, and they talk about other impact factors which have strange names. However, I would say most of what we're talking about is how the emerging regions need to change in order to fit in with the traditional publishing world, whereas the title of this talk is actually the opposite. How does the traditional publishing world have to change to cater for that increased output? So I would say perhaps with a little flexibility. I don't mean lowering the standards, but I do mean being a little more flexible with the claims that these journals are making, or publishers, when they talk about things, we shouldn't automatically disqualify them and consider them a little bit more in terms of what they are providing and what they might bring to the big databases. Anyway, in the interest of time, I'm going to give way and bring up Marianne, the next speaker, and invite you to listen to what she has to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. Hello, everyone. It's really great to be here. So I think I'm going to follow very nicely. You're going to see this conversation go on, and my only regret is that this is only an hour. How can that be? Because I think we could be here until late this evening talking about some of these issues. Make a room for research. The emerging world takes a seat at the table, and when one is provided a seat at the table, it's an opportunity to be heard and to make a difference. And as scholarly research from emerging areas is included in Web of Science, it increases the whole global perspective, if you will, and deepens the subject coverage. I don't want to hammer you with a lot of statistics, but I will a little bit, just to sort of prove our point about what we're doing in terms of the tremendous amount of research that's coming to our content selection team. Many of you may know Web of Science as a really large but dynamic resource. It's a window, if you will, to the state of global research as it is right now. And we have all different kinds of content types, as you know, journals, books, proceedings, but also data sets and patents, and we're really very international in scope. We do, in fact, pay attention to language, and we have, as a matter of fact, we cover journals from 45 different languages. Of course, we have some basic requirements as to what journals should provide in terms of English language titles. That helps enormously, and keywords and abstracts and some of the basic bibliographic information. So I think it's important to keep in mind that there are multiple languages. Of course, what do we frequently say? English is the language of science. It may not be the language of humanities, but certainly most journals are publishing in some form in English. The latest, so we have 4 journal databases now, and we, if you are unaware, recently launched a couple years ago the Emerging Sources Citation Index, and that was launched in 2015, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that has evolved and where it's going. But we also have a keen interest in regional databases. So we have included Cielo, which includes English language journals as well as Spanish and Portuguese journals. And we also include Russian, Korean, and Chinese citation databases on the platform. And 2 days ago, if you were on Twitter or wherever, we announced that Clarivate now has a partnership with the Egyptian Knowledge Bank, which is Egypt's Egyptian government digital library and online hub, to launch the Arabic Citation Index in 2020, which I think is really great and really huge for researchers in that part of the world. And this is part of Egypt's 2030 vision to make Egypt more of a knowledge economy. So I think there's going to be some really interesting and big things coming our way in the next couple of years. So how about that Emerging Sources Citation Index? And I've heard from many people different things about it, but it does provide access to trends and research well beyond the high-impact journals. And I must say it has dramatically expanded the research coverage in Web of Science. And, you know, the rejection rate is quite high, as many of you might know if you've submitted to us in the past. But the content that we might not be quite impactful enough for inclusion in what might be considered the journal impact factor databases in science and social sciences, they're still good, sound, quality journals. And they bring a much wider view, particularly on regional topics and perspectives. And I think, you know, we're very well aware of that. So with Emerging Sources, which we launched in 2015, we are building a 10-year back file. So we have expanded coverage of some of these journals back to 2005. And as of, I think, just a few days ago, Emerging Sources Citation Index is now available on Insights, Benchmarking, and Analytics, which is our research evaluation tool. So, you know, institutions, organizations, governments are going to be able to analyze the underlying data and performance of these journals that are included in that database. So I think, you know, the Emerging Sources journals do not currently get a journal impact factor, but they do gain journal citation counts at the article level, and I think the ability to be analyzed more fully for ranking and assessment purposes, I think is going to be very valuable to the scholarly communications community. So a couple of facts. So because we've launched Emerging Sources, we've increased journal coverage on Web of Science by 42% easily. And I think what's interesting to me is that the addition of these 7,000 additional journals has resulted in 2,000 new publishers being discoverable. Their content is discoverable on Web of Science. We have 2 million additional articles available for research. There's quite a number of the journals that are open access, about 2,000, and this is determined by whether or not they're in the DOAJ. You'll notice that there's a very high spike in the life science coverage, but I think what's significant is that the arts and humanities has doubled, which is really great to be able to say that we're truly reaching for total coverage and truly being a multidisciplinary database for all kinds of researchers. The biggest growth that we've seen in a subject category has been in education and educational research, which is a subject category in the social sciences. So as of now, I think it's interesting that some people have said very negative things about being accepted and included in ESCI, but in fact, what we found that in 2 years' time, some journals have really gained considerable visibility and impact and have actually been selected for inclusion in the Web of Science flagship databases. And I expect that that will continue to grow. Science Journal from the University of Ghana and the Journal of Medical and Biomedical Science, which is from the University for Development Studies in Northern Ghana. And that is a particularly depressed area, very low income, and so it's really exciting that we're able to give researchers from that particular university, which I think was founded in like 1990-something, an opportunity to publish and to have papers that are represented in Web of Science. Oop. Okay. So we've talked a bit about authors wanting to publish in international journals and what that looks like in Web of Science. And we've seen, just as you heard from Pippa and from Phil, tremendous research output, particularly from Latin America and Africa, Middle East, and Southeast Asia. And that has continued to increase with the inclusion of the Emerging Sources Citation Index. So I decided that I would look at the author affiliation, because authors from emerging countries really want to affiliate with other and collaborate with other authors so that they can get their papers published in international, large commercial journals, perhaps that have a high impact within the journal citation reports. And so you can see a significant increase in the number of papers now with the inclusion of ESCI. So for example, Cuba. We selected 18 journals from Cuba for inclusion in Emerging Sources Citation Index, and they come from Cuban universities predominantly and research centers, and they've added over 7,000 papers to the Web of Science. So Cuban research, if you will, has increased by 60%. And also, one thing that is, I think, particularly cool is the fact that we've added 27 new countries into Web of Science because of emerging sources, and contributions from 146 journals account for those additional new countries. Our inclusion of conference proceedings papers matches very closely to what you've been finding with research from areas like India and Russia in particular, and Malaysia. So we do index conference proceedings, and as you can see, this is a terrible slide, but there's an awful lot of data in it. And so what I did was sliced and diced and just pulled out to highlight some of the key percentages that I think are significant. And so I took two sets of 5-year periods and compared the increments to see where the largest growth happened to be. And of course, it has, it's India. There was a 209% growth in a 5-year period for the conference papers that were submitted. Curiously enough, China grew by 29%, while the US declined by 19% in terms of conference papers that were published and indexed in our Conference Proceedings Citation Index. So is there a happily ever after for journals from emerging countries, and maybe even from frontier markets or even developed nations? And I think it depends. Publications are really expected to adhere to very clear and transparent peer review practices, and to remain consistent and refrain from making false claims. And what we're seeing is that that isn't necessarily so, and I think publication ethics is a challenge. And we curate our collection. We want to be absolutely sure that the content that you find in Web of Science is the very best that it can be, that it is the most impactful, the most insightful information that researchers can use. But occasionally, we have to deselect from the collection, and most often those reasons for deselection include that the journal's publishing late or not at all, or they're suddenly drying up with papers, very, very little contents being published on an annual basis, or there's improper publishing practices, citation manipulation. Many of you are aware that we do suppress journals in the journal citation reports for citation stacking and high self-citation rates, so we monitor that. When we see a lack of editorial focus or novel content, or there are, studies that are really not relevant, when we see a huge change in scope, that difference between what it means to be an international versus a regional journal. The International Journal of Butterflies, just as a for instance, might one would expect that there would be a fully international editorial board and that the authors would be well represented globally. But if we find that 60% of the authors are coming from a particular country, well, then it's really not quite an international journal anymore. Its focus has changed. And so we do keep an eye on that. And we really demand, and I think it will be increasing going forward, very strict standards of ethical publishing. And I think we could spend probably a whole day talking about that alone. But I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marianne. And I'd like now to call Duncan to come and give his intervention.
Great. Thank you very much. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the humorous anecdote that would have been the highlight of SSP 2018. Okay, so my name is Duncan McCrea. I work for Wolters Kluwer. I wear a few hats there, but one of the hats that I wear is that I work with a publishing company that Wolters Kluwer owns based out of Mumbai called Medno Publications. And I just want to share sort of our experiences. Most of the speakers here have dealt with content in terms of individual content and authors, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the journals themselves that we manage that are based in developing markets. So Medno has about 450 titles across 25 countries. A lot of those are newly launched journals that have launched since we have launched with us. In other words, we didn't acquire a mature title. They're generally not included in major indexes as a result of that. What we see is a lot of them have no staff, so it'll be an editor-in-chief. Maybe they've managed to wrangle in some help from one of their departments in the institution, but there's not a managing editor. There's often not editorial assistants. And a large part of the issue that we deal with is the perception of those journals as being from developing markets and sort of the inherent disadvantages. Part of that is bias, and a lot of that, what I'm going to mention on the next slide, is sort of their own doing. Those journals all aspire to be something. They aspire to be internationally recognized, i.e. get indexed. And I think probably as a publisher, our biggest challenge is managing those expectations. There's an awful lot of discussion that I have with individual editors, and I say, well, what's your 5-year plan? You've just launched. And they say, well, in year 2, we're going to be in Medline. And I sort of say, well, that might not actually happen, so we need to talk about that. So when I say things that they do of their own accord that might hurt their perception, mentioned earlier, there's a lot of international journal of and world journal of that occurs. And these are usually attempts to increase submissions. They think that if they say international, that means that international authors will be attracted to them. There's obviously some cultural quirks that go on. One of them is, and most of the Medno journals are based in India, and they love icons and badges. So when you go to the websites, and we've dealt with this, but when I first started working there, every single available banner, logo, badge existed on the homepage. Those things you used to see sort of like www 3.0 compliant, and nobody knows what that means or cares, but that would be on there. They are particularly susceptible to things like unofficial impact factors, questionable indexes. I've had an editor email me and say, I need all the PDFs of every article we've published plus the cover of the journal because I've been asked to submit it to be part of this new index. And I had to explain to them that most indexes don't require your entire issues in PDF form. That was clearly going to get resold in some way. And then the other one is sort of hiding their affiliations. We run into this quite a bit. If it's a small institution, a regional, and it's a regional journal, they sort of don't want people to know that because they think it sort of will lead to a negative perception. But at the same time, the worst sin is to not be transparent about who owns your journal. So we run into that quite a bit. So these are a lot of issues that we see typically and have been dealing with in the last 3 or 4 years that Wolters Kluwer has been very actively involved in Medno. So what do we do then to break the cycle of why these strategies fail? As I said, most of these are shortcuts in order to try and get past these perceptions. So we have to get rid of those shortcuts. The problem is that all these things that they've been doing further drive away the U.S. and European authors that they aspire to get, and then that in turn makes it harder to gain reputable indexing. So all of these things are sort of self-perpetuating, and so we as a publisher have to develop a strategy that we can help these journals with to try and break that cycle. So what we did at Medno in particular is recognizing the lack of staff and also recognizing the sort of lack of guidance that these journals were receiving. We created our own sort of management team to provide editorial strategy. It was not only to provide strategy, but also one of the issues was not necessarily a malicious attempt to act unethically, but more of a just general lack of knowledge about what standard practices were. And so we have a team of people in Mumbai who basically act as managing editors for the entire portfolio. So if there's a circumstance of academic misconduct, it gets routed through this team to ensure that the journal handles that instance perfectly well and doesn't try and skirt the system. It used to be, and maybe still the case, but these journals, especially new journals, were so afraid of retracting an article because they thought that it would look so poor, it would reflect so poorly on them, that they would go to any length to not retract an article, which of course led to some behaviors which we would not encourage, and we have done away with that kind of thing. We really emphasize the importance of standard practices. We try and follow all the COPE and WAMI and ICMJE and all these things, and we try to instill in them the idea that just because things may have been done a certain way with Indian journals for the last 30 years, if you want to be an internationally recognized journal, you have to behave in a way that's consistent with what we consider the way a journal should act. And the one thing that we did as well was sort of developed an indexing strategy that is across the portfolio. And so instead of just sort of the squeaky wheel getting the grease and filing applications for any editor who just happens to be able to get my home number somehow, we actually have sort of a strategy for the entire portfolio. So journals have to, for us, prove to us that they are following the guidelines and following standard practices before we will file an application on their behalf. So we've been doing this for about the last 3 years at Medno. I got involved in 2014. So we have this editorial team that works collaboratively. Those incidents of academic misconduct are handled properly, so we no longer are constantly answering questions. I don't get as many emails from Retraction Watch anymore, which is pleasant. Those editorial strategies, as I say, they're based on these sort of editorial fundamentals that we preach to them. As a result, we have sort of seen the indexing acceptance rates move above what we would consider the norms. But more importantly, what we're seeing is journals actually listen to us now and not just suggest that we bribe somebody at the indexing agencies. I'm sorry about that, by the way. Probably removed a steady stream of revenue. The future concerns, this is something that we've seen recently, which are indexes, and I think you sort of mentioned it, Marion, this idea that journals get reevaluated, that even though they may be in the index, they might actually be removed at a future time. We've seen this happen with PubMed Central to a couple. That's a specific situation where PubMed Central has changed the way they do the application process, and now they are going back to journals that were accepted under the old application process and sort of looking at them now under the new way and evaluating those. I'm not going to editorialize about that because there is a very slim chance that somebody from NLM and PubMed Central could be in this room, named Chris Kelly. And Scopus also does this where they reevaluate who copy edited this slide. There are at least 3 spelling errors in this slide. Deeply ashamed. Phil, I thought you were going to review this when I sent it to you. I've passed the buck. Yeah, sorry about that. And Scopus reevaluate based on metrics, or at least that's what they tell me. So if a journal is not living up to its performance comparatively to other journals in its therapeutic area, they might drop it from Scopus as well. So the old days of sort of getting into an index and sort of saying, okay, I'm in now, I can start worrying about things, is no longer the case. Journals really have to maintain their performance, and in some cases maybe even improve on their performance in order to maintain their indexing. I think that's it. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much, Duncan. And I think we just have time for one or two questions. Also, this session is going out live all around the world. It's being beamed to people watching virtually. So if there are any questions from the virtual people, also please let me know. Anyone with any questions? Sir.
Anthony Watkins, cyber research. There's been a lot of debate. Yeah?
Yeah, there is.
I was doing my best. There's been Okay. Yeah. There's been a lot of debate on a number of blogs and lists about the distinction between obviously predatory, we don't use the word predatory anymore, but predatory journals and good journals making a real effort locally, and the sort of things that INASP and AJOL run. Now, the difficulty seems to me to find the division. How do you tell for sure that this journal is not predatory? It's a worthy journal working hard. Okay? Can anybody answer?
I think that one is for Pippa.
Thank you for the question, Anthony, and the answer is no. Next question. No, I mean, it is a huge problem. There are obviously fraudulent journals, but then there's a huge grey area of journals that are, doing things that are either foolish or simply because they're under-resourced. And, it's a massive problem, and I don't think there is an easy way.
We've had instances of journals actually being hijacked. Journals, particularly the small, often in humanities where they're a print product, usually from museums, as a for instance, and someone comes along, they see that it's in Web of Science, and all of a sudden there's an online version, and it really isn't the real journal, unfortunately.
Madam at the back there.
I'll bring you this.
I have a question for Marion, specifically around the rationale of creating the emerging sources database. And it seems like it's now a two-tier system in order to get an impact factor. Some journals go automatically into the core collection. There are some publishers who maybe have, this high impact reputation that you talk about. And then the rest of the journals, if you didn't get in your new launch before 2015, now you're waiting an extended period of time, an unknown period of time for that new impact factor, which is then really important to drive those submissions and get that publication frequency because it's such an important number. And so I just want to understand, couldn't these, inclusion of these journals have been done without a new index, without another barrier, which is how I'm viewing it currently, and maybe just, prolong the evaluation before these, emerging sources can then get an impact factor?
I think that's an excellent question. And I would say that, for Web of Science, we are looked to and our users expect that we are going to have the highest quality, most impactful journals that appear in the journal citation reports. And we wanted to make that distinction. And we have a close to a 90% rejection rate for those databases, which is huge. But, are the journals that have been rejected bad journals? No, they're really good journals, and I think Emerging Sources Citation Index gives those publications an opportunity to be discoverable on the platform, so it makes sense for us. And also, I think there was and has been some misconception that Emerging Sources Citation Index is I've heard it be described as purgatory. It isn't. And that some journals will benefit from that exposure and be evaluated at a future date and find themselves in either the Science or Social Sciences Citation Index. However, we also expect, though this hasn't happened yet, that there will be some journals in the big three flagship databases that maybe have lost their range, their influence, their impact. They're at the very bottom of the category in the fourth quartile. They may find themselves being reevaluated and moved, either deselected completely for whatever reason or moved into ESCI. So I think, there have been any number of journals that have been waiting, have applied over and over again for decades and have never made it in to Web of Science. So I think ESCI is an opportunity, particularly for those journals coming from emerging regions, to be fully discoverable. And some publishers are absolutely delighted that they have that opportunity. Their authors are thrilled to be able to say that their papers are in Web of Science. Do you have a journal in ESCI?
Yes. And we have journals in the core collection. If we would have just launched it 1 year earlier, it probably would get an impact factor. And so that's...
Maybe not. Most likely not. And we should talk.
Yes. I'd be happy to.
Other questions? Anything from the virtual? No?
Nothing.
Okay. In that case, I think that I should just thank the panel, and look forward to any further questions in the aisles. Bye-bye. Thank you.